So let me make a start. A warm welcome to everyone for joining us in this joint CRA, Center for Research on Aging and Center for Population Change Connecting Generations seminar. I'm Athena Vlahantoni, I'm based in the University of Southampton. We're delighted to welcome Professor Susan Harkness from the University of Bristol in the Department of Social Policy. Susan is well known to people who work in the areas of social policy. All her career, she's worked on inequality and earnings from a lens of gender as well. She's an economist by training. Am I allowed to say that? Yeah. But yeah, it's a compliment. And we're very delighted because what she will be talking about relates to a number of past, current and future work in the Center for Population Change and the Center for Research on Aging. So with no further delay, let me give the floor to Susan to talk about children, earning penalties and income inequality.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Athena. Okay, I think my title might have changed slightly since I first entered, and in particular, I think I was originally going to talk about the US and the UK. So I'm going to talk mostly about the UK today, and I'll sort of maybe tell you a little bit about what the findings for the US sort of say, but I'm going to spend most time thinking about the UK. Okay, so let me just move quickly on. Sorry, slide problems. It's been a while since I've used Zoom. Let me just tell you a little bit about the motivation behind this work. So what I want to think about is how children affect inequalities between families, and obviously thinking about how, in particular, motherhood pay penalties influence the sort of distribution of income. I'm going to focus on couple families, and I think what sort of motivates this is really this sort of growing literature that really shows that children have increasing disparities in their access to resources, and we know that this growing inequalities between children is really affecting their outcomes. And so there's a sort of wide range of outcomes people have looked at. So cognitive outcomes, non-cognitive outcomes, and behavioral outcomes all seem to be growing in terms, inequalities in them seem to be growing, both in the US indeed and in the UK. Now, a lot of this literature, some of this literature is related to changes in family structure. So we know the work at McClanahan sort of talks about diverging destinies, as does Putnam talking about disparities in kids' outcomes. Some of this relates to changes, in particular the growth of single parent families, but there's a sort of another thing going on there is what's happening to female employment. And it's really the sort of changes in female employment opportunities that I want to focus on in this paper. And I'm only going to look at couples. I have separately looked at single parents, and indeed, you know, these child penalties associated with single parenthood are indeed really large, but I'm not going to talk about those today. Now, why do we think it might be important to think about what's happening to mothers' employment? Well, one of the kind of key reasons for doing this is because we know that maternal employment is increasingly linked to family income. And of course, in the UK, many of you will have heard of the sort of need for the two-earner family, how families with only one earner are increasingly at risk of poverty, and so on. So we know that mothers' employment matters, and it increasingly matters to family income. Now, in terms of sort of stylized facts about what's happening in the labour market in the UK and indeed elsewhere, we know that highly educated women, so the more educated, are much more likely to be engaged in the labour market. And that might either be because they're more likely to work at all and to participate in the labour market, but also if they do work, they're probably going to be working longer hours than those with lower levels of education. So part-time work is increasingly frequent, but it's more common amongst those with lower levels of education. Now, so on the one hand, we have this sort of trend in the labour markets where those that have got better education are performing relatively well in the labour market and kind of increasingly gaining ground. And on the other hand, we've got this growing economic homogamy, which means that increasingly people are partnering people that are kind of similar economically to themselves. And work in the US suggests, the work by Christina Schwartz in the US suggests that this growing homogamy is increasingly linked to inequality. So she suggests, I think, that around 40% of the growth in inequality in recent decades was related to this growing similarity in the economic circumstances of spouses within, when she looked at couple level inequality. So this growing economic homogamy clearly seems to matter too. Now, on the other hand, we know that there's increasing female employment is related to reduced inequalities. And when we look across countries, I've done some work on this, published in 2013, as has Renzi Nauwenhaus, and indeed many other studies now showing that higher levels of employment, female employment over recent decades, are linked to lower levels of inequalities between couples. Okay, now what this work doesn't do is think about the effect of children on inequality. So what I want to do is just really focus in on the role of the children play in driving inequalities between couples. Now, just to sort of link this to what we know about family earnings, we know that family earnings, women's earnings, we know that women's earnings take a massive hit following parenthood. And there's this incredibly well-known and widely cited study of Henry Cluven and colleagues from 2019, where he calculates earnings penalties to parenthood for women and men, and he looks across a range of countries. The countries here are the US and the UK. What we can see is that when the first child is born, we have this kind of really very large drop in earnings. Drop in earnings for women. So the average earnings penalties over a decade is around 44%. And in the US, it's a little bit smaller at 31%. But these really very large drops in earnings. For men, they find far less effect on the annual earnings that people have after they have children. But another thing that's quite important to note is that unlike other studies of pay penalties to motherhood, which focus on wages, this is really focusing on the combined effect of changes in wages, changes in participation, and changes in working hours, which mean that people's individual earned income falls. Okay, so given this massive fall in individual earnings, you'd think so it's somewhat surprising that people haven't previously looked at how this drop in earnings affects the level of income to any great extent, or the distribution of income. And I should say that I haven't seen other studies that, for example, that have looked at whether these earnings effects vary across women by, for example, education or their location in the earnings distribution. Okay, so the aim of this study is I'm going to focus on opposite sex couples, opposite gender couples, and I'm going to assess how parenthood affects their income at different points of the distribution. I'm going to think about the distributional change in these different income components. So I'm going to think about how parenthood affects individuals' own earnings, how it affects their partner's earnings, how it affects couple level earnings, and how it affects the level of disposable income, which is after receipt of transfers. The earnings I'm going to look at are all net, and that's because I really want to think about the impact on what people have in their pockets, I suppose. And then the final thing I'll do is think about the implications for inequality and see whether parenthood does indeed lead to widening inequalities. Okay, so the original aim was also to compare the UK and the US. I'm only really going to focus on the UK findings today. We have some results for the US, but there's some slight issues with the comparability of the data at the moment and getting hold of the data. So for that reason, I'm going to stick to looking at UK data. But there are various reasons we think it might be interesting to compare the UK and the US. One is that the penalties to parenthood are a bit larger in the UK. We also suspect there'd be quite different distributional implications, partly because of the nature of employment and which type of women work in the two countries. And then the other thing that we think matters is the generosity of welfare. So clearly the UK has a slightly more generous welfare system, decreasingly so, but nonetheless better than in the US. And of course, we would expect that to reduce the impact on inequality of changes in maternal earnings. Okay, now just before I go on to think about our findings, I want to just focus a little bit in on what we already know about child penalties. And there's been a really large literature on how motherhood and indeed fatherhood affects income. So just starting with motherhood, we know that becoming a parent is a sort of critical point in terms of people's careers, and it often triggers these really large changes in employment, hours of work, wages and earnings. So all of these sort of labour market dimensions are affected. In terms of background, in terms of what we know about employment, we know that, I think I've already said, but just to sort of remind you, women from lower SES backgrounds tend to be more affected, their employment tends to be more reduced. And this has sort of now been evidenced in a number of studies. So motherhood has a stronger effect on the employment of those with lower levels of education. Now, wages, wage penalties is something that have been really very extensively researched now by various people, and there have been a host of recent studies looking at the distributional effect of motherhood on wages. What this tends to find is that, in fact, wage penalties, whilst employment is more affected for those with lower skills, higher skilled women face higher wage penalties. And the suggestion here is really that that higher skilled women really suffer from taking time out of the labour market because the returns to getting additional work experience is so high. So motherhood has a greater effect at the top than at the bottom. So slightly sort of mixed findings in terms of employment, and therefore what we might expect to happen across the earnings distribution if we only look at the earnings that women receive. Okay, now of course, if we think about what happens following parenthood, it's very unlikely that it would just be the mother's earnings and labour supply that's going to be affected. When children are born, we would expect there to be greater income needs, and labour supply of men, fathers, might respond to that. And in addition, we might think that that if a woman, whatever happens to a woman's labour supply will affect what the man does and vice versa. So we've got these joint labour supply decisions to consider. So how fathers' earnings are affected is not entirely clear, but what we might predict is that the partners of women who reduce their labour supply the most are likely to raise their labour supply to try and make up for some of those losses in earnings. And we also might expect that those mothers who carry on working may have partners who reduce their labour supply or don't increase it as much as they might otherwise in order to accommodate these additional care needs. So clearly the relationship with what happens to the couple's earnings is really going to be quite complicated. And then the other thing that, of course, matters to family income is the level of social transfers. I'm not going to talk about taxes because I'm going to look at net earnings and net income, but a sort of significant part of the income package, particularly for those with children, is social transfers, which will tend to be higher when you have children, and also tend to be focused on those with lower incomes, so are likely to reduce inequality. So just another dimension that is going to have a really important effect on inequality. It's probably quite important to note there are other components of income, but they're typically amongst couple families pretty small. So they're not ones I kind of want to spend too much time thinking about today. Okay, just in terms of what evidence is there in terms of fatherhood and the labour market, we know on average men's earnings don't really seem to change very much when they become parents. So where there are changes observed, this is typically considered to be a sort of function of selection. So depending on, so if there is any change, it's small, but most studies suggest small or no wage penalties to fatherhood, or indeed earnings penalties in the case of the Cleveland study. Now, there have also been studies on how wages are affected across the wage distribution. And again, the sort of evidence really points to suggesting that actually there isn't much effect of fatherhood on wages at any point of the distribution. So if there are effects, once again, they seem to be pretty small. So I think there's a study by Accardi et al. It finds small effects, but I think compared to the motherhood effects, they're really not something that I think are going to drive very large changes in inequality. On the other hand, if we think about male employment, some work we did for the Government Equalities Office a while back suggested that low-skilled men perhaps raise their labour supply following the birth of a child. So it could be that whilst there's no effect on average on the earnings of men, or indeed on the wages of men, if we have differential labour supply effects across the distribution, that might again influence the distribution of income. Now, moving from earnings penalties to motherhood, earnings penalties to fatherhood, to inequalities amongst couples, so couples earnings inequalities, or indeed income inequality, is quite complex. And let me just try and explain why. So I've put some of the sort of factors that affect the overall level of family earnings or income level inequality. So there's a number of factors that matter. So first of all, female earnings, the distribution of female earnings. When children are born, we would expect, well, in fact, we would expect the distribution of earnings may change, and we'll see how that changes in a moment. But if the distribution of female earnings becomes more equal, that might reduce inequalities between families. On the other hand, if it becomes more unequal, it will raise the distribution of, it will increase the inequalities between families. Okay, the second factor that matters is going to be the share of family income from female earnings. And again, there's a number of factors going on here, but clearly if we see the share of female earnings in family income falls, and if female earnings is less equally distributed than male earnings, then we might expect that to have a sort of positive effect on increase in inequality. Equally for male earnings, if male earnings, well, we may predict that they don't change very much following parenthood. On the other hand, if there's some increase in the earnings of at the lower end of the distribution, then we may see some narrowing of inequality. But overall, it may be that we don't predict a great deal of change following the transition to parenthood. We know that males earnings take up a greater share of family income following parenthood. So there's sort of quite good evidence on that now. And if their share increases and if their distribution is more unequal, then we might see inequality rise. Okay, so these are some of the things that matter. The other thing that has been emphasized, I think, in the literature on the economic homogamy of spouses is this idea that the correlation of partners' earnings really matters. And the correlation of partners' earnings, whether there's a strong correlation, clearly that will increase inequality. But what we might expect to see is that parenthood, if it affects the earnings of all women, it might tend to reduce the correlation of partners' earnings. And there is some evidence from other studies that this is the case. And then the final thing that really matters for what happens between households is what happens to social transfers. And we would expect social transfers to moderate some of the effect of parenthood on income inequalities. Okay, just sort of fairly briefly. So clearly there's a range of things going on. So parenthood might affect the distribution of male and female earnings. Parenthood is going to affect how much women's earnings compose, how large a composition part of family income is composed of female earnings, and it's going to affect correlations in family earnings. So there's lots of sort of quite complex things going on here. Now, what do we know from other studies about what happens to couples when children are born? So one thing to just note is that, first of all, when children are born, mothers' earnings typically fall, and as a result, not terribly surprisingly, we see mothers' share of family income drop. The other thing that's been observed in the studies by Kelly Musick and her colleagues is that the correlation between the earnings of partners again tends to fall. So we see this reduced correlation in the earnings of parents once children are born. And we'll see what that looks like. This is evidence of the US. We'll see how this looks in the UK in a minute. Studies on how parenthood affects income tend to suggest that earnings penalties to motherhood are associated with lower family income, but don't look at the distribution. But on the other hand, we know that among couples, when women work more, income inequality falls. And just to add a further dimension to this sort of quite complex picture we saw in the previous slide about how the overall level of family income inequality is affected by parenthood, we also know that when earnings are pooled, so when men and women pool their earnings, this has a sort of, as Lamb says, it has a powerful tendency to equalize family income. And it's much more that, therefore, when you look at family income combined, it's likely to be much less unequal than the distribution of male or female earnings separately. So given this, that motherhood reduces employment typically on average and reduces the level of earnings of mothers, we might expect, ceteris paribus, that household earnings inequality falls and that income inequality also falls following the birth of a child. Okay. Now, I've got a couple of slides about differences we might predict on the US and the UK, but I'm not going to focus on those for now. Let me just talk a little bit about the data that we used. So we're going to use data from for the UK, it's actually from the Understanding Society, and for the US, we've got data from the PSRD. Not going to talk about the US results today in any detail, but what we're able to do with this data is link it to data from the cross-national equivalence file, which is essentially derived from both of these original data sources, but harmonize the measures of income. And this is quite important, it's particularly important for the US because of the way income is calculated. Okay, I've got 11 years of panel data that I'm going to use, and my sample is just couples, individuals living in couples, and I'm going to focus on those on age 22 to 54, where there are positive earnings, couple earnings. So I also include some men and some women which have zero earnings, as long as the household itself has positive couple earnings. Okay, the outcomes I'm going to look at are earnings and income which are net of taxes, and these are reported as derived variables in Understanding Society and in CNEF. Income, I'm going to look at income, and of course I'm going to deflate these various outcome measures to constant prices. Okay, now the methods I'm going to use are unconditional quantile treatment effects models, and this allows us to assess how parenthood affects the distribution of income amongst couples. I think the best reference for this is the Riasavilla-Morato paper from 2020. But one thing that's really important to note is that there's quite a lot of sort of controversy, I think, around the most appropriate type of quantile methods to use, depending on the question you're asking. So I'm going to use the quantile treatment effects models because Riasavilla and Morato argue that when you have this sort of 0-1 binary variable, unconditional quantile regressions are not actually appropriate, even though previous studies have tended to use UQI. Quantile treatment effects, I think, are slightly better method. So it's essentially a two-step procedure, and it's essentially a reweighting procedure. So we reweight the distributions. So we reweight all the couples without children to look like to see how they would look if they had the similar characteristics as those with children. So we do that and we construct a sort of new distribution for those with and without children, hypothetical distributions, matching them on characteristics, and then we're able to use rift regressions at different points of the distribution to see how parenthood affects inequality. Okay. I'm going to look at male earnings, female earnings, couple earnings, and disposable income. And the models I'm going to run are going to be all with fixed effect, so we can see what the sort of changes are happening here. So just before starting, let me just quickly look at some descriptive statistics. So starting with the labour earnings of women. So these earnings data is collected monthly, but it's sort of multiplied up. So, you know, it's not our ideal measure of annual earnings, but it's the best we've got from Understanding Society. And what we can see here is that if we look at women, we've got this distribution of earned income estimated over the year. And when children arrive, we then get this leftward shift of the distribution. So we can see a lower level and perhaps a slightly more equal distribution. However, it's also really important to note that there is a change in the number of women with zero earnings. So we have a growth in the numbers with zero earnings from 9 to 21%. Okay, what happens to male earnings? Well, we've got no children. We have this sort of black line once again, showing the distribution of earnings, and what we see when children arrive again is this shift in the distribution. So it's sort of slightly higher average and a slight shift to the right. So men across the distribution seem to be on average, and these are just descriptive statistics, doing slightly better, but a slightly more unequal distribution. Women with positive earnings seeing a lower level of earnings, but also a more equal distribution of those in work. But there are increases in the share that are not working. What happens to couples earnings? For couples, we see, well, and again, just in the raw data, what we see is this, again, a shift in the earnings of couples, and the couples earnings distribution, again, shifts a little bit to the left. So a lower level of couples earnings, and yeah, and again, a slightly less peak distribution, suggesting some increase in inequality. Household income, a pretty similar, well, a similar pattern, I think, in some ways to what happens to couple earnings, but of course we see the effect of transfers moderating some of that change. Okay, the other factors that mattered for our overall picture of inequality is the correlation of earnings. And this picture just really illustrates where we have a percentile of male earnings along the bottom, along the x-axis, and then we have the average, what happens to women's average percentile along the y-axis, and we can see that the crosses are those with no children, and the circles are those with mothers. And what we can see is essentially this weakening of any correlation that previously exists. So the correlation is relatively weak anyway, but we see it declining over time. Also important to note that it's men's earnings that are really strongly correlated with sort of the total earnings or total income of the household. Female earnings much more weakly correlated. Okay, and then finally, and actually I've run a fixed effects model here to show what happens to the share of female earnings in income. As you can kind of also pick up in the previous graph, the share of female earnings, well, the amount of female earnings falls, and as a share of the household budget, we can see that parenthood reduces the share of the household budget by a coefficient of 0.73. So in other words, for those without children, the average share of the budget is 0.4, and it falls to just under a third when children are born, so reduced earning shares. Okay, now just moving on to the quantile regressions. What do the results from the regressions show? So this is, rather than the descriptive sort of kernel densities above, just want to show you what happens if we actually then condition on other factors. So here, using fixed effect models, And what happens to earnings? We can see that there's much stronger drop in earnings, again, driven by employment, work hours and wages, towards the bottom end of the female earnings distribution. For male earnings, we get a sort of rather different picture. So a bit of a drop at the very lowest percentile, and then a bit of an increase in the male earnings around, well, the upper half, but not quite the top. So again, not really the homogeneous picture we might have expected. We see more of a gain for those middle earning men. Couple earnings, when we join these male earnings and female earnings together, it's really important to know we can't just sort of sum these lines, because unless the earnings of men and female are perfectly correlated, you know, how this translate into the changes in the couples earnings distribution is really you know, dependent on these sort of other factors going on. In other words, who partners who in particular. What happens to the couple earnings distribution? Well, we can see it is in fact the lowest earning couples that see the biggest declines in their earnings, and this is partly because, as we saw in the picture above, that women have the biggest earnings penalties to parenthood. We also know that there's a correlation between being a low female earner and having relatively low income, even if it is imperfect. And so this does indeed translate into what happens to the couple earnings penalties, bigger drops at the bottom, and indeed at the top we see, if anything, possibly a small gain, although the confidence intervals are relatively wide. And the overall effect on family income, again, we see once we equivalize, we see these sort of distributional effect where we have household income falling more at the bottom than at the top. Okay, so this is suggesting to us, and if we go on to sort of more formally think about what happens to inequality levels, these pictures suggest that household income inequality is going to rise as a result of these parenthood penalties to motherhood, and the way they correlate with male earnings. Okay, and indeed, if we do kind of do these similar decompositions, but this time looking at the Gini coefficient as our outcome measure, what we can see is that across each of these distributions, parenthood contributes to widening inequality. So female earnings, the Gini coefficient following parenthood goes up significantly, and by quite a large amount if we compare it with the constant. So the constant is just going to be the level of inequality for those without children. Parenthood raises that level of inequality in terms of female earnings. Here, one difference we also have here is that we've included zeros because we're using levels rather than logs. Partners' earnings, we get little impact in the Gini coefficient on father's earnings. Couples' earnings, we again find that inequality, parenthood raises inequality in couples' earnings, and equally it raises inequality in household income. It's perhaps also worth considering the differences in the levels of inequality of these different distributions. So what we actually see is that female earnings without children are a bit more unequally distributed than those of their partners. And that increases when they have children, so it adds this 0.076. We also see that couples earnings are, because when you join these two distributions together, it tends to reduce inequality. And what we see here is that couples earnings are less unequal than the earnings of either the men or the women in the household. So that's what we would expect to find. But again, parenthood tends to offset this effect to some extent. And then finally, we see that household income inequality is a little bit lower again. And again, as we would expect to see, because we think transfers will help support the incomes of those at the bottom of the distribution a bit more than those at the top. Okay. Of course, the Gini coefficient is just one measure of inequality. And the other thing we can do is kind of try and unpick at what points of the distribution inequality is changing the most. And what I have here is basically the measures of the 75th to the 25th centile, the 90th to the 10th, and the 90th to the 50th. And what we can see is that pretty much across these measures, we tend to see that parenthood tends to raise inequality. But there is some small variation depending on which part of the distribution you look at. And I think most notably, perhaps, is what seems to be happening at the 75th, 25th centile for female earnings, where we see some compression of the distribution. So it's not necessarily a very uniform picture. There is some variation depending on where on the distribution we're looking. And again, we can pick these differences up from the diagrams shown before. Okay, I'm just going to conclude. So just to conclude, what overall really the findings show is that motherhood tends to raise inequalities between women and couples. And we saw that because for those with lower earnings, we see a greater earnings penalty to motherhood than for those higher up the earnings distribution. So we get this increasing inequality between those with children compared to those without. And then the second thing we see is that it raises within household inequality. So we can see that women's share of household earnings are reduced, and this clearly also has a further effect on what happens to the overall distribution of income, because the relative shape of these distributions matter, and if one takes up a smaller part of the distribution, then it has an effect on the overall pattern of inequality. And then the third thing we see is, the third thing we see is that the correlation of partners' earnings declines. And if we see a decline in the correlation of partners' earnings, of course, what we would expect to see is that inequality, it's inequality reducing. Okay, so the net effect is indeed as we predicted. So motherhood, and this is partly because it reduces the employment and earnings of mothers, going the wrong way, sorry, leads to an increase in inequality. So parenthood contributes to growing inequalities between families, and that is, it increases inequalities between families, it increases inequalities between women, and it increases inequalities within the household. So there's lots of kind of dimensions of inequality that rise following parenthood. But I suppose, of particular interest was what happened to the level of income inequality. And we can see that it appears again to be where motherhood penalties are large, we get the increase in inequality between families. And although the welfare system, so the changes in household income, to some extent compensate for those changes, it's not enough to offset the effect of parenthood on the distribution of family income. Okay, very preliminary findings for the US suggest there's slightly different effects going on there. So let me just very briefly mention what's happening when we compare the UK and the US. So we've got a slightly different effects going on there. And whilst we see a similar pattern in terms of female earnings, this gradient in the earnings penalty, for men, the effect of parenthood seems to be a little bit different, and male earnings play a stronger compensating role, but we have taxes and benefits doing a lot less to stabilize income. So we get a similar picture, but slightly different things going on. And of course, there are quite a few limitations to this study. First, I only consider couples. Second, I haven't considered selection into parenthood. And although we do a lot to sort of try and absorb things by including fixed effects, selection might still matter if people plan parenthood, of course, over prospective careers and growth in income, that might matter. And then the other thing we haven't done, and I think we will do in the future, is think a little bit about how the years after birth matter. So we know that these effects, certainly in Cleveland's model, sort of show a persistence over time, but it would be nice to unpick a little bit further whether these effects vary for those with very young children or older children. And when we think about the gender pay gap, we know that these earnings penalties don't narrow with age, but the kind of important question is whether inequalities in household income may perhaps close. So I think that's for the future. Okay, stop there.